I'm Franklin. This story is about a secret pilot who did something very important. In 1982, the horizon over the Caribbean wasn't just a line where the sky met the sea. It was a conveyor belt. If you flew low enough to kiss the waves, you weren't a pilot. Vi byli prизраком. And in this game, ghosts were the only ones making a killing. The air in the cockpit of the Cessna 441 Conquest smelled of high-octane fuel, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Jack Slider Thompson adjusted his Ray-Bans as the sun began to bleed over the Florida Keys. Behind him, in the modified fuselage, sat 400 kilograms of Peruvian gold, packed tighter than a politician's secrets. Voodoo 1 to Scarecrow, we are feet dry, switching to the low road, Jack whispered into his headset. He banked the plane, dropping altitude until the white foam of the Atlantic was close enough to spray his windshield. At this height, radar was a myth. He was flying underneath the reach of the law, navigating by instinct in the glow of the dashboard lights. Miami was a neon jewel in the distance, a city built on a foundation of white bricks. In 1982, the skyline of Miami grew faster than any city in history, funded by a currency that smelled of kerosene and blood. "Welcome home, Slider," a voice crackled through the secure UHF channel. Jack didn't smile. He knew that every successful landing was just a temporary reprieve from a long walk off a short pier. 10 minutes later, he touched down on a private, unlit strip in the Everglades. The moment the engines cut out, the humidity of the swamp hit him like a physical blow. The darkness was alive with the sound of cicadas and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of idling black Suburbans. A man stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't wearing a Hawaiian shirt or gold chains. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked too hot for the Florida night. This was Special Agent Miller from the DEA, but Jack knew better. Miller's paycheck came from a department that didn't have a public address. "The delivery is clean, Jack?" Miller asked, his eyes scanning the tree line. "As clean as a slaughterhouse floor." Jack jumped down from the wing, his boots sinking into the mud. "The big man in Medellín is getting restless, Miller. He's tired of the donations to the Contras. He wants a seat at the table in D.C. Miller lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating a face that had seen too many betrayals. "Pablo wants to be a politician. We want him to be a bank. Tell him the contract stands. He provides the product, we provide the sky, and the money funds the freedom fighters in Nicaragua. It's a perfect circle." "The circle is starting to look like a noose," Jack spat. "I saw the cargo they loaded in Medellín for the return flight. It wasn't just cash. It was crates of Stinger missiles. Who are you guys planning to shoot down with those?" Miller stepped closer, the smell of tobacco and authority cloying in the damp air. "The kind of people who ask too many questions on remote airstrips, Jack. Take your cut and go get some sleep. You're flying back to Colombia in 48 hours, and this time, you're bringing a guest." Jack watched the black vehicle swallow his cargo. He felt the weight of the envelope in his pocket, $50,000 for one night's work. In 1982, that was a fortune. But as he looked at the silhouette of his plane, he realized he wasn't a pilot anymore. He was a vital organ in a monster that was outgrowing its creators. In the early 80s, there was a place in Colombia that felt more like a sovereign nation than a ranch. It was called Hacienda Nápoles. It had a private zoo, a bull ring, and a private air force. But the most dangerous thing about it wasn't the hippos in the lake. It was the man who sat on the porch, sipping coffee and deciding who lived and who died in 3 different hemispheres. The flight back was different. Jack Slider Thompson wasn't flying solo this time. In the co-pilot seat sat the guest Miller had mentioned, a man who called himself the accountant. He was thin, wore a cheap polyester suit, and spent the entire 6-hour flight staring at a set of ledgers that contained more numbers than the U.S. Treasury. "Don't look at the books, Jack," the accountant said without turning his head. "The math is too heavy for a man who lives by the altimeter." "I just fly the bus," Jack grunted, banking the Cessna as the lush, jagged peaks of the Andes rose up to meet them like the teeth of a saw. "But I know a war chest when I see one. You're not DEA. You're CIA Treasury, aren't you?" The accountant just adjusted his glasses. "I'm the guy who makes sure the money for the company doesn't show up on a tax return. Just focus on the landing strip. It's shorter than you remember." The landing strip at Hacienda Nápoles was a narrow ribbon of asphalt carved out of the dense, emerald jungle. As Jack touched down, he saw the reception committee, a dozen men in tactical gear with Galil rifles, led by a man with a thick mustache and eyes that held the boredom of absolute power, Pablo Escobar. The heat in Antioquia was a different kind of monster than Miami. It was sweet, heavy with the scent of tropical flowers and the faint, underlying stench of gasoline from the processing labs hidden deep in the hills. "Slider, my favorite bird," Pablo shouted, spreading his arms wide as Jack stepped off the wing. "You bring me the white paper from Washington or just more promises?" "I brought the numbers, Pablo," Jack said, nodding toward the accountant. They walked toward the main house, a sprawling white villa that looked like it belonged in a dream. But the dream was built on nightmares. As they passed a lake, a massive hippopotamus surfaced, watching them with tiny, ancient eyes. "The Americans think I'm just a farmer, Jack," Pablo said, leading them onto a wide terrace overlooking the valley. "They think I provide a service for their parties, but they don't understand. I am the central bank of the New World. I pay for their little wars in Nicaragua because it's good for business, but business is about to change." The accountant stepped forward, opening his ledger. "The agency is satisfied with the last quarter's revenue, Senor Escobar. But the shipments to Little Rock need to double. We have a new offensive starting in El Salvador. We need the cash liquid." Pablo's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Liquid? Like blood? No? Tell your masters in Virginia that if they want more, I want a guarantee. No extradition. I want to sit in the Colombian Congress, and I want the DEA to stop burning my fields in the South. If I don't get my seat, the planes stop flying, and the money for your freedom fighters disappears." Jack felt the air turn cold despite the tropical sun. He saw the look on the accountant's face, a flicker of something that wasn't fear, but cold, clinical calculation. Later that night, Jack sat in a guest cabana, unable to sleep. The jungle was screaming outside, monkeys, birds, and the distant hum of the labs. He heard a knock on the door. It was the accountant. "Slider, we're changing the flight plan for tomorrow," he whispered, his face pale in the moonlight. "We're not taking the usual route. Miller and the boys at the CIA have decided that Pablo is becoming a liability. He's starting to believe his own myth." "What are you saying?" Jack asked, his hand going to the knife he kept in his boot. "The next shipment isn't going to Miami. It's going to a secret strip in Panama. And the product isn't cocaine. It's the evidence we need to sink him. But here's the problem, Jack. The cartel has a mole in the agency. They know we're moving against him. So, I'm flying a target on my back? Worse, you're flying a bomb. If we don't get that ledger and the recording of tonight's meeting out of Colombia, the agency will burn us both to protect the project. You're the best pilot I've ever seen, Slider. Tomorrow morning, you're going to have to prove it." Jack looked out at the lights of the hacienda. He saw Pablo standing by the pool, a king in his own world, unaware that the very men who had built his throne were already sawing through the legs. There is a specific kind of silence that happens just before a war starts. It's the sound of the jungle holding its breath. At 4 a.m., Hacienda Nápoles wasn't a playground for a billionaire. It was a trap made of high-end stucco and tropical vines. Jack Slider Thompson didn't wait for the sun. He and the accountant moved through the tall grass toward the airstrip, their shadows stretching like ink stains under the pale moon. Jack could feel the vibration of the Colombian soil through his boots, the heavy, rhythmic stomp of guards on patrol. "The ledger is in the wing compartment," the accountant hissed, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest as if it were a shield. "If we don't clear the canopy in 3 minutes, we're not going to Panama. We're going to a hole in the ground." They reached the Cessna. The plane sat there, cold and indifferent, a silver bird waiting for a soul. Jack swung into the cockpit, his fingers moving over the switches with the muscle memory of a man who had spent 10,000 hours in the sky. Click, whir, cough. The left engine spat out a cloud of blue smoke and roared to life. Suddenly, the darkness of the strip was shattered. Floodlights, blue, harsh, and unforgiving, erupted from the guard towers. "Alto! Fuego!" The first burst of machine gun fire stitched a row of holes across the Cessna's tail. Jack didn't flinch. He slammed the throttles forward. The engine screamed in protest, the propellers clawing at the thick, humid air. "Jack, they're on the runway," the accountant yelled, pointing at a black Jeep racing to cut them off. "Hold on to your soul, pencil pusher," Jack roared. He didn't wait for the full runway. He pulled the yoke back, forcing the plane into a premature climb. The stall warning horn began to blare, a high-pitched, steady scream of "Death! Death! Death!" The wheels of the Cessna clipped the roof of the Jeep with a bone-jarring thud, sending the vehicle spinning into the brush. They cleared the tree line by inches, the belly of the plane scraping the tops of the mahogany trees. Jack banked hard, turning toward the coast, pushing the engines into the red. "We made it," the accountant gasped, collapsing into his seat. "We're not anywhere yet," Jack growled, checking his mirrors. "Look behind us." Two shadows were rising from the hidden hangars of the hacienda. Two vintage T-28 Trojans, fast, nimble, and armed with wing-mounted .50 caliber guns. Pablo's private air force. "They're faster than us, Jack. In a straight line, yeah. Но в Карибском море сейчас сезон гроз. Мы уходим в стену." Ahead of them, the horizon was a bruised, terrifying wall of black clouds and jagged violet lightning. The Intertropical Convergence Zone. To most pilots, it was a graveyard. To Jack, it was a hiding place. The first tracers from the T-28s whizzed past the cockpit, glowing like angry fireflies. Jack dove. He plummeted toward the ocean, the altimeter spinning downward like a heart rate monitor in cardiac arrest. 500 feet, 200 feet, 50 feet. The Cessna was vibrating so hard Jack thought the rivets would pop. He entered the storm. Inside the clouds, the world disappeared. It was a chaotic symphony of gray rain, violent turbulence, and the smell of ozone. The plane was tossed around like a leaf in a hurricane. Beside him, the accountant was throwing up into his briefcase, but Jack didn't care. He was flying by the seat of his pants, feeling the air currents, dodging the mountain-sized thunderheads by instinct alone. "Did we lose them?" the accountant choked out. Jack looked at the radar. The two blips behind them had vanished. They had either turned back or been swallowed by the lightning. 2 hours later, the storm broke. The sky turned a pale, sickly yellow as they approached the Panamanian coast. Jack saw the hidden strip, a dirt path carved into the jungle near David. "Landing gear down," Jack muttered. As the wheels touched the dirt, Jack saw the reception committee. It wasn't the welcoming arms of the agency. It was a line of olive-drab trucks and men in mismatched uniforms. The Panamanian Defense Forces, Noriega's men. Jack taxied to a halt. The engines died with a final, wheezing cough. The door was ripped open from the outside. A man in a camouflage uniform stepped forward, his face pitted with scars. It wasn't Miller. It was a man Jack had seen in the Black Book archives back in Vegas, a shadow operative for the cartel CIA liaison. "Welcome to Panama, Mr. Thompson," the officer said, leveling a pistol at Jack's head. "I believe you have some paperwork that belongs to Senor Escobar, and the agency would like to ensure that you don't live long enough to explain why it's missing." The accountant looked at Jack, his eyes wide with the realization of the ultimate betrayal. "The circle," Jack whispered, remembering Miller's words in the Everglades. "It's not just a noose, it's a closed loop." Франклин делает глубокий вдох. Вот она, развязка, момент, когда все нити сходятся в тугой узел, и герою приходится принимать последнее, самое сложное решение. В этой игре нет победителей, есть только те, кто доживает до следующего раунда. Case File. 16. The Medellín Connection. Part 4. The Zero-Sum Game. I'm Franklin. In the shadows of the 1980s, the war on drugs wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with ledgers. The numbers balanced only when enough bodies were left in the dirt, and the men who counted the cash didn't care whose blood was on the tally. The Panamanian airstrip was a dead end. Jack, Slider Thompson, and the accountant stood in the humid jungle, surrounded by Noriega's soldiers. The officer with the scarred face, Captain Vasquez, wasn't interested in small talk. His pistol was pressed against Jack's temple. "The ledger, gringo," Vasquez snarled, his eyes fixed on the accountant's briefcase. "Senor Escobar is very particular about his accounting, and the Americans are very particular about their secrets." "It's over, Jack," the accountant whispered, his face ashen. "They're going to kill us both. The agency will write it off as a cartel hit. Pablo will claim it was the DEA, clean as a whistle." Jack looked at the Cessna. The plane was bleeding fuel from a bullet hole in its tank. He saw the ledger, the proof of Project Mirror, of CIA funding for the Contras, of a drug war fueled by its supposed enemies. And he saw his own face in the reflection of the scarred officer's sunglasses. A tired man who just wanted to fly. "There's another way," Jack said, his voice surprisingly calm. He looked at Vasquez. "Your boss, Noriega. He knows about this ledger, right? He knows what it means for his relationship with the White House." Vasquez's eyes narrowed. "General Noriega is a man who knows many things. Then he knows this ledger is his insurance policy," Jack continued, pointing to the accountant. "If that book disappears, the CIA will have no reason to keep Noriega in power. He'll be next. But if he has it, he controls the game." The accountant stared at Jack, then at Vasquez. A flicker of hope, or pure terror, crossed his face. "He's right. This isn't just a book of transactions. It's a map to every dollar funneled through Panama to arm the Contras. It's proof that the U.S. government is a silent partner in the Medellín cartel." Vasquez hesitated. He looked from the accountant to Jack, then to the sky, where the distant thrum of a helicopter was growing louder. More incoming. "We need the book, Jack," a new voice cut through the air. A black Ford Bronco skidded to a halt on the runway. Stepping out was Special Agent Miller, the man who had met Jack in the Everglades. Behind him, 4 heavily armed DEA agents, but their eyes held the cold, detached professionalism of the company. "The ledger stays with the agency, Captain," Miller said, his hand on his sidearm. "It's a matter of national security." Jack watched the standoff. The Panamanian forces, loyal to Noriega, against the American operatives, loyal to a covert operation. The accountant was stuck in the middle, holding the only thing that mattered. "Nobody moves," Jack said, his voice ringing with a sudden, desperate authority. He pulled out his own knife, a Bowie he'd used for survival in the Amazon. "This ledger doesn't belong to Escobar or Noriega or your handlers, Miller. It belongs to the history books." Before anyone could react, Jack spun. He grabbed the accountant's briefcase, and with a single, brutal slash, he tore through the leather binding. Rip. The accountant gasped as the pages of his meticulously kept ledger fluttered into the humid air. Jack didn't stop. He threw the entire contents of the briefcase into the Cessna's fuel tank, where it mingled with the spilled aviation fuel. Then he grabbed a flare gun from the cockpit. "This is a zero-sum game, gentlemen," Jack said, aiming the flare gun at the Cessna. "No winners, no records, just ash." Miller snarled. "You fool! That's classified material! You'll destroy everything!" "Exactly," Jack replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "If no one has it, no one gets hurt, and no one gets to rewrite the history to their liking." A single fiery red flare shot from the gun, arcing through the air and plunging directly into the Cessna's fuel tank. Boom! The plane erupted in a spectacular fireball that lit up the Panamanian jungle like an unholy dawn. The roar of the explosion was deafening, sending a shockwave that knocked everyone off their feet. Paper, leather, and years of carefully calculated betrayals turned into smoke and flame. When the last echoes of the explosion faded, only the acrid smell of burning fuel and paper remained. The ledger was gone. The plane was a smoldering wreck. Miller looked at Jack, his face a mask of rage. "You just signed your own death warrant, Slider. The cartel won't forget this. The agency won't forgive this." "Maybe," Jack said, dropping the now empty flare gun. He was covered in soot, but his eyes were clear. "But at least now, nobody gets to profit from the truth, and nobody gets to use my plane to deliver their lies." Jack Thompson, the ghost of the skies, vanished into the Panamanian jungle, leaving behind a smoking crater and a deafening silence. Jack Slider Thompson was never seen again. Some say he made it to Belize, changed his name, and retired to fly tourist charters. Others believe he was eventually found by either the cartel or the agency, and his fate was sealed somewhere in an unmarked grave. Pablo Escobar continued his reign of terror for another decade, but without the financial off-books support facilitated by the CIA, his political ambitions were severely curtailed. He remained a king of crime, but never became the president he dreamed of. The CIA's covert operations in Latin America continued, but the Project Mirror blueprint became harder to implement without the seamless, untraceable cash flow that Slider Thompson and his Cessna had provided. The Medellín connection was eventually broken, but the roots of corruption remained. History remembers Pablo Escobar as a drug lord. It remembers the Contras as freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on who you ask. But no one remembers Jack Thompson. His story, like the ledger, turned to ash. But sometimes, when a storm gathers over the Caribbean and the radar screens show an inexplicable blip, old pilots whisper about a ghost who flies too low, protecting a secret that burned itself out in the Panamanian jungle.